update, Piotr, another update for you. We're talking about what is Iran's strategy in striking Cypriot bases. Well, we've got an answer to that question, and it seems that the strategy is working. Breaking Cyprus asks for British guarantees that its bases will only be used for humanitarian purposes. So Iran's goal is to have these countries pressure the US, pressure the West, and not being involved militarily. Well, Cyprus is doing exactly that after just one strike hitting the country. They don't want to end up like the Gulf nations and having the airports closed. One of the airports is already closed. And this is happening right now with Cyprus asking for British guarantees that they will not be involved militarily.
Well, I'm seeing also
for humanitarian purposes.
I've got an update here from ABC. All American bases are now on heightened alert, according to US officials. They're now under threat condition Bravo, which is the Department of Defense's policy defined as.
What if we have the same thing from Gulf nations? Gulf nations are saying they might join the war, but on the other side, they might do the complete opposite. They might ask the US to stop using their bases. And that puts the US in a very difficult position. If the Gulf countries, so they've got two paths. They can either join the war, or they can two extremes, or just ask the US to stop using their bases, so Iran will no longer target them, and their economy and their airports can open again. How long can countries like the UAE or Kuwait or Bahrain have their airports closed and their economy, I wouldn't say in a standstill, but taking a hit? Tourists are coming to the country, and the country not dependent on tourists, but tourists play a big role in the economy. So if I was Iran, it's a pretty well-calculated move. Let me keep pressuring those countries, pressuring their economy, the countries that pride themselves on security and stability. Let's shatter that image until those countries pressure the US or force the US not to use their bases, and then Trump will need to find an exit ramp. And one indication that might also be working is the reports we saw yesterday, according to Heightened News, I think it was, and one other source. The US, Trump, through two countries, was seeking a ceasefire with Iran. Not sure if you saw that news, and Iran refused, according to those reports. So could those be indications that Iran's strategy is working? And this time around, Iran is not only better prepared, but the strategy is much more calculated. And now we just got a report from Kabul News. Taliban spokesman says Afghanistan ready to support Iran if US attacks. Well, the US just attacked. I'm not sure when this came in. So that was a promise earlier. That was before the war. Sorry. So before the war, Afghanistan said they're ready to join the war. They haven't said it now. So they haven't joined the war yet. Not sure if that makes a difference. So they sent me an article that came in before the war. But just on the strategy first, Piotr, isn't it working? Couldn't it also work in the Gulf nations the same way it's working in Cyprus?
Well, I think it's a bit early to tell exactly what the mindset is for the Gulf states are not Cyprus. Cyprus is a tourist. It's a small island. It has little to no military whatsoever. It's also a divided nation. Keep in mind, it still is divided from northern Cyprus and Turkey after 1974, and southern Cyprus, which is, well, okay, it's a sovereign state, but there's a lot of influence from Greece there, right? And of course, the British bases is the third element. Where Gulf states are much more clearly defined sovereign states, they're also much clearly aware of the immediate threat that Iran poses. What I find interesting is that the Saudis have continued to engage the Iranians, like they what's the word? They called the Iranian ambassador to demand an explanation for X, Y, and Z. And I find that a bit weird. Like, what they're clearly keeping the diplomatic channels open. If they had no interest of trying to find an off-ramp for this entire situation, then they would just kick the entire, Iranian regime's diplomatic missions out. So I think that it's difficult to apply the principles of Cyprus to the rest of the Gulf. But this is, again, it comes back to the same message that you said and we mentioned before. Iran's strategy is quite simple, realistically. They can't go toe-to-toe with the Americans and Israelis together, let alone they struggled against the Israelis last year. I know that some people will not like me saying that, but they didn't outright beat Israel. They could have maybe lasted longer if the war had gone on more than 12 days. But quite clearly in this case, they have reorientated their strategy towards applying pressure across multiple fronts, across multiple, what's known in strategic studies as decisive points. You find a line or a point in the line of defense which is weak enough that you can apply enough pressure that it breaks. That was a very standard policy used by the Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. So in this case, Iran is trying to find decisive points across multiple fronts, which he can then apply enough pressure on to break through. Cyprus is an Achilles heel. Lebanon is an Achilles heel, where if they can galvanize enough of Hezbollah to respond, well, then we've got a potential ground force conflict ongoing, which is a much more complicated thing. And where war
could we see civil war in Lebanon? Because we've got now the Lebanese Prime Minister just said we need to disarm Hezbollah now. Let me see what language this is. That's English. But he essentially said we need to disarm Hezbollah right now. That's a pretty big statement for the Prime Minister to make. And there's been fears of civil war. If Hezbollah is weak enough, there's been talks about the government, actually the parliament in Lebanon voted to disarm Hezbollah, for the military to disarm Hezbollah. So everyone was talking on whether they would do that forcefully or just wait for Hezbollah to politically accept it. But how much pressure until, I think there's going to be a point where Hezbollah is going to be weak enough for the government to directly start to disarm them, because that would be the only thing that would allow Lebanon to prosper, is just having one military. As we've known historically, two militaries in one country just doesn't end well. So could we end up seeing, the worst case scenario of all this for the region, a civil war in both Iran and Lebanon? Iran's got all these separatist groups, the Baluch, the Kurds, the Azeris.
Azerbaijani Iranians.
Yeah, exactly. So you got all these different separatist groups, and you've got power struggles between the Artesh, the Iranian traditional military, and the IRGC. And there is no leading opposition figure that can take over from, Pahlavi. I don't think has enough support. And Lebanon has been through decades of civil war, and now there's Hezbollah splitting the country in the middle. Half the country, plus or minus, depending who you want to listen to, they want to support Hezbollah. The other half don't. The government most of them want to see Hezbollah disarmed. It just seems like a perfect recipe for a civil war in both countries.
I think the prospect of a civil war in Lebanon is more feasible in the short to medium term than it is in Iran, just because of sheer size. I'm not an expert on the intricacies of Lebanon, Hezbollah, Israel. When we were covering it together in the sort of that period of the heightened conflict, I became more familiar with it. But from my understanding, because of the very systematic way the IDF went about weakening the militia group, I think that the Hezbollah group, they were so wanting to ensure that they remained politically relevant that they kind of made concessions. So I still feel that is a key driver of theirs, a key motivation, because if they lose their political foothold, then the militia doesn't have much ability to influence politics. It's just considered more of a non-state outcast actor, even if it does have missile.
Yeah, if Israel destroys Lebanon enough, Hezbollah's decision to join will become more and more unpopular.
Well, I think Israel would be. The French have made comments around Lebanon in the past, and I think that would be a pretty sticky situation for the Israelis and the French. I'm thinking because of the French's obviously colonial relationship to Lebanon. Lebanon's a tough one. Iran, I think we're too far away for a civil war. That was the third scenario I was going to talk to you about.
Why too far away?
Because the Islamic Republic are holding right now.
Yeah.
The Islamic Republic are holding.
They planned for it as well, Pyotr. They've got the helicopters they bought from Russia. They were designed for domestic security. And then these helicopters are not going to strike the Gulf nations. They're not going to strike U.S. bases. So they would be there for any separatist groups, maybe even protesters that are armed, or obviously if there's any special forces in the country, which I don't think will happen.
Well, I just think that the Iranian situation is much more fluid than Lebanon right now. The thing about Lebanon, it's a powder keg that could kick off much quicker. And because, again, of the simple just size of it and proximity to Israel, the intensity of that could go much quicker. Because Iran is only largely a aerial campaign, we are getting reports of explosions X, Y, and Z, but they are...
Just got a report. Sorry to interrupt you. EU gas prices keep rising.